Hello there, folks, and welcome to part 2 of 4 of our civil rights video lessons. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So, in this video lesson, we're going to talk about the following topics. Okay, one thing in particular I want you guys to pay attention to is de facto versus de jure segregation. We're going to get into that in a little bit. We're going to revisit or review the separate but equal doctrine and Brown versus Board of Ed. Very, very important key Supreme Court case. It is a required Supreme Court case for the AP exam, but regardless of the exam, you should know about this anyway, right? We're going to talk about some of these other important acts of legislation as well. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, and again, the Civil Rights Act of 68. So here we go. So, end of the separate but equal doctrine. Now, again, separate but equal doctrine said that as long as there are separate but equal facilities, then you could have, whites only, blacks only, different types of facilities, right? Now, of course, separate was not equal, okay? So the white schools and the white bathrooms and the white facilities were far, far superior, much more well-funded, much more well-maintained than anything for that of people of color. It was inherently unequal. It was massively unequal. And the Supreme Court case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Ed, states that. Matter of fact, the courts ordered the schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Now, unfortunately, up until the 1960s, many schools remained segregated. Matter of fact, the South fought tooth and nail to prevent these things from happening. When it came down to it, I had to call in the National Guard in Little Rock, Arkansas, to actually force integration in the schools. The president had to authorize that because the local and state government refused. So here's the timeline that was from part 1, right? And I want to revisit this because there's a lot of different things that pop in here. So for our purposes, I just discussed, just briefly discussed Little Rock desegregation, and that happens over here, right? We've been talking about Brown versus Board of Ed here. So I want to also draw your attention to the Birmingham protests. We are going to read Letter from a Birmingham Jail in class. This is an essential document. It's also required for the AP exam. It will be on it. But forget about the AP exam. You need to know it because you need to know it, okay? It's just important key aspects of American history that we need to be aware of. So, again, pay attention to this timeline. Write down the key ideas that stand out to you, and we'll talk about these in more detail in class, right? So you can pause the video, write this stuff down, and then go. This is the other half of the timeline. Again, pause the video, write this stuff down. Excuse me, and we'll discuss this in more detail in class. Okay, so now let's talk about integration, right? So there are 2 types of segregation. There's de facto segregation, and there's de jure segregation. De facto is in existence because of social and economic conditions, all right, and residential racial patterns. So this is a social, cultural context here. De jure segregation is legal segregation. These are things that stem from government. And one of the key issues of our day is now that we've, for the most part, obviously there's key criminal justice reform that needs to be enacted. We'll talk about this more in class, namely civil asset forfeiture. But there are plenty of regulations that are not properly followed, right? But legally speaking, segregation that is conferred by law or supported by the legal system is largely gone, okay? Now we're left with the social, cultural aspects that allow segregation to persist. The real question is what to do about that, right? And there are a lot of different ideas out there about how this should be approached, who should be in charge of it, at what speed or what pace it should be achieved. And we're going to discuss all of these in class via Socratic seminar. I want to hear your thoughts and see, you guys are the next generation. You're going to inherit all this. So where do you think we should go? Now, during desegregation, there was court-ordered busing that occurred, and the hope was that it would improve educational outcomes. But the research that we have shows that court-ordered busing actually did not improve educational outcomes, didn't help much. We also, in the last 20 years or so, in particular, 30 years, we've had a resurgence of majority-minority schools. And this is contributing to this de facto segregation. And again, how to solve that, that's a tough one. And nobody has a clear cut answer to that. It's being hotly debated as we speak. So, the civil rights movement in the 1950s, you begin to get a peak, or maybe not a peak, but a massive, massive momentum comes from the civil rights movement. You've got Rosa Parks, you've got Martin Luther King Jr., right? You've got the Black Power movement and Malcolm X. So, now we're going to talk about these two leaders, these two thinkers in class. And there's a lot of propaganda surrounding Malcolm X and the Black Power movement in particular. The news media contributed to this propaganda. The federal government was active in trying to discredit both Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. We're going to talk about what that, how that set back civil rights, that propaganda machine that was employed against all of these leaders, but in particular, Malcolm X and the Black Power movement were particular targets for the FBI. Of course, we know that Dr. King was assassinated and Malcolm X was also assassinated. So we're going to talk about these ideas more in class as well. But just as the civil rights movement was really building up a lot of momentum, that's when a lot of key focused attacks started coming to block the civil rights movement from gaining success. So, but despite the attempted blocking, we have some successes, right? We get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We get the Voting Rights Act of 65. We get the Civil Rights Act of 68, right? And there was another Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1991. So there are successes being made. That's not to discount or ignore or discredit the very legitimate concerns of what's happening currently in our country and what has happened since. I'm not in any way trying to delegitimize that. But despite the backlash and despite the resistance, there were successes that we were able to achieve during this period of history. And we'll talk more about these in detail in class, but you should write all of this down. All right, so what was the impact of these items of legislation? Well, in particular, let's take a look at the Voting Rights Act, right? So we have a massive increase in black voter registration. Once the Civil Rights Act was passed and began to be enforced, we have massive improvement in black voter registration. I mean, if you just take a, well, let's go to the next slide because I have a close-up of this graph, right? So look at Alabama, we're down there, and then by 2004, Georgia had a significant bump at Louisiana, Mississippi. I mean, Mississippi was practically non-existent in 1965, right before the passage of this act. So you can see that these pieces of legislation made a real, significant, and positive impact in the ability of black people to actively utilize their constitutional right to voting. So some consequences. We do have massive political participation increases, not just in African Americans, but also in other minorities who were discriminated against as well. You have economic and educational conditions improve. They don't equal that of white populations, but they do improve. Anti-racism has become the new dominant ideology in fighting against the systemic inequality. But we do have, as I mentioned earlier, lingering social and economic differences and disparities. Discrimination and racism are unfortunately alive and well in the United States, and we need to learn about all of this, see what's been done in the past, to contemplate what can be done going forward so we can deal with this and attempt to remove these disparities. That is the goal of our day. That's the order of our day. That's what we need to be focusing our attention on. So it's important that we learn about these concepts so we can have more positive impact moving forward. So that ends part 2. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in part 3.